Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. I'm going to start this time by sharing an experience I had while I was drafting my notes for this episode. I've almost never made references to current issues. The podcast is not intended to be time-bound or contextual in that way. But in this case, the topic of human consciousness and the social climate of America actually dovetail nicely. And they dovetail in the form of an experience that I'll share. As I speak, it's early 2025. Here in America, we're early in the second term of President Donald Trump. The past 2 months since his inauguration have been especially chaotic and confusing, a statement I think holds true regardless of where one places themselves on the political spectrum. Without going into details, I will say I'm not a fan, but I only say it here because that's a necessary piece of information to understand the experience that I had. In my daily time of meditation, as one element in my practice, I pause to extend compassion, to wish good in all its fullness, including for the president, in the president, and also that good in all its fullness might be manifested through the president for others. Well, here's what happened inside of me during my meditation on the day that I began writing the notes for what I'm actually saying in this very moment. First, I was aware, as I often am, that I didn't feel compassion. Indeed, I felt anger, and to be honest, I felt condemnation, not just for his actions, mind you, but I felt it towards him as a person. Now, I'm not proud of that feeling, but I need to be honest. Next, as is my habit in such cases, I paused to try to check that feeling and to cultivate the intention in myself to counter it with compassion and the wishes for good I mentioned above, good for him, in him, and through him. Now, so far, what I'm describing is pretty much my normal daily experience, but then it changed in 2 ways. The first change was that I began to allow myself to be aware of what it is in him that so bothered me, in his ways of speaking, in his actions and decisions, in what appears to be his attitude. And as I did so, I had to allow myself to be aware that those things are not just in him, they're also in me. What I saw included defensiveness, the need to be right, the need to be affirmed and admired, the difficulty I have in admitting being wrong and making mistakes. I had to admit that yes, the seeds of all that are in me too. Then the second difference is that I began to imagine a scene, spontaneously, without planning this. The scene was a press conference in which I was the president. It wasn't really me. It wasn't President Caldwell. I was President Trump. In the news conference, I was asked a question by a reporter from a paper which tends to be highly critical of the president. And the question was rooted in a criticism of some action or another. And here's how I responded to the reporter as President Trump. That's a very good question, and I will need to look into that. I will look into that, and I promise to come back to you. Thank you for asking questions, and thank you for doing your job. Now, that's not the way President Trump normally responds, nor do most politicians, of course, to what I would call critical questioning. It's not the way that I always respond. So what was happening? I think in some way, I was channeling or manifesting or aspiring for a different way. I was being that different way. And by being that way, I think I was in some small way trying to change the energy, his energy, and my own. I believe, actually, that such moments do matter and can impact things. It changed me, and while I can't prove it, I believe it can change others too, including, hopefully, the actual Donald Trump. Now, what if more of us did that sort of thing more often, for more situations and for more people, including for people whom we find it difficult to appreciate or like? If so, might it grow into a wind of larger, lasting change? I think so. Well, now, how does all that dovetail with consciousness? I'm going to come back to that experience, actually, closer to the end of this episode. But first, I want to come at the topic about consciousness from a very simple starting point. I want to come at it empirically. How is consciousness at work? And let's start by just thinking about the ways we use the word and see what that tells us. So we say things like, what really hurt was that you made a conscious decision to whatever. Or, had I been conscious of the fact that you were planning to do that, then I would never have. Or, he became unconscious and. Or, if she remains unconscious, you'll need to make some decisions. Consciousness. We use the word all the time, so obviously we know what it means, right? Well, it turns out that even in our day-to-day language, we occasionally reveal that we somehow know less about consciousness than we think we know. So, for example, I suppose subconsciously I was hoping, or some part of me probably knew this wasn't a good idea, but... So it seems that we speak as if we know, and at the same time we speak in a way in which our speech reveals that we know there is more to consciousness than we know or understand. I've reflected on consciousness at various points in my creative life with poems and songs. I'm actually going to include one here, which is processing some of this mysterious nature of consciousness. And I admit, the poem actually smuggles in the idea of the divine before I intend to explore that in the podcast. And so if you're not ready for that, then for now, feel free to ignore that part if you prefer. I'm sharing it because the poem raises questions about myself and who I am, what it means to be a person, questions about what it means to be a who. The poem is called Questions. Now, as you listen to it, it may sound a bit stilted. In part, that's because it's a translation. It's translated from something I originally wrote in the Urdu language, which is one of the languages of much of the poetry of South Asia. But here's my poem, Questions. Questions. I say I'm here before you, but who is this whose voice says am? I've been traveling long years in a direction that only leads me further and further away from myself. Who am I? We seem compulsive about our ideas about you, the maker, the source. For the moment I leave aside the ideas about you, do any of us know ourselves? Every heart seems divorced from its heart. Who are we? Truly, then, only you are the one who is, truly. Are you far, near to us? Which, truly? Are you present or not present? Perhaps you're both, truly. Who are you? Am I, truly? Are we, truly? You're the only one who can truly say, am. Me? We? You? What's the meaning of these words, truly? In the end, there's no clear answer except for this one. You. 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 If so, then you're who? In this case, the question and the answer are the same. You are who? You are who? Lots of questions. For now, let me get back to my empirical description of consciousness. For the past several episodes, I've been exploring what consciousness is and where it comes from, what things have it, and how it works. And I've described consciousness as a function of two ingredients, and you're familiar with this if you've been listening: experience and awareness. What we refer to as consciousness in my functional descriptive model varies based on the interplay or mixture of those two things. Empirically speaking, that's based on what my own observation suggests. The workings of consciousness may range from just pure experience, with no awareness of the experience, all the way to experiencing and being aware of experiencing and being aware of experiencing. In addition, I proposed another more complex dimension of consciousness too, but it's not one that I came to empirically, it's more speculative. And that's the possibility that a subject, in addition to their own experience and awareness, might, as a subject, a first-person I, also experience the experiences, awareness, and awarenesses of being aware of other subjects. Now, so far, I've spent the episodes focusing on the things that most of us would be least likely to assume have any type of consciousness. Rocks. And so I've talked about rocks, and rocks, until I'm sure people are getting tired of rocks. Well, the good news is that I'm putting down the rocks, and I'm picking up human beings. But I can hear a voice in my head. Wait, hold on. What about plants and animals, insects, etc.? Is the plan to leap from rocks to people and just jump over things like plants and animals? Well, yes, actually. So let me explain. I'm not doing so because I came to the realization that rocks are somehow more important. It's because I came to the realization that if rocks were in any way conscious or connected with consciousness, then it would follow, for me at least, that more complex forms of things and beings might be as well. Now, there's a logical flaw in that approach. The one doesn't necessarily imply the other. So if A, rocks, and B, animals, are both C, things, and A, rocks, is also D, conscious, it does not automatically mean that B, animals, is also D, conscious. But given what quantum physics and religion and philosophy led me to conclude about rocks and subatomic particles, it seems a fair presumption to make that plants and animals, etc., would be conscious in the same way at least as rocks. Now, ultimately, I'm actually not trying to prove that. I'm not trying to prove a case. Throughout the podcast, I've been thinking out loud as I explore these things. And as I say at the outset of every episode, I'm exploring all of this as an artist, meaning I'm trying to see and interpret as an artist, but also meaning that I'm working on the podcast as if it were an artistic creation. And that means I don't actually have it all figured out. So I can't argue a case even if I wanted to do so. It means also that along the way I'm changing how I see things and coming to various revised or new conclusions. And if you've been following along, you've seen some evidence of that. Conclusions which I realize are for now, because things could change by next year, or next month, or by the next episode. So for now, I've come to conclude that rocks, or to be more precise, the subatomic particles that in the aggregate make up a rock, are conscious in at least this sense, or in this possibility. If consciousness and reality are entangled, then it follows, for me at least, that everything in the cosmos might be conscious, or that at the very least, if the things in the universe are not conscious themselves, they are at least deeply connected with some sort of consciousness in ways that affect how they behave at the level of, for example, their subatomic particles, including rocks, and for me, by extension, plants and animals and more, everything. And so now I come to ask, what about human beings and human consciousness? And in my descriptive model, I do think human beings exhibit 3 of the dimensions of consciousness that I've proposed, namely, human beings experience events and stimuli. That's the first dimension. They're aware of experiencing them, second dimension. And humans are aware that they're aware of experiencing these, the third dimension. However, there are, as we all know, exceptions and variations. Let me start with exceptions. There are temporary exceptions to humans having all 3 of those dimensions, as when we're asleep, or under anesthesia, or we pass out, And there's more permanent exceptions, of course, such as when a person is in a coma and doesn't recover. There's also variations. There can be intentional variations, such as the decision to take certain drugs that alter what we experience and the way in which we're aware. There can be variations we don't choose as well, such as dementia and various forms of mental illness. Then, too, there are the exceptions and variations that are reported in many spiritual heritages attributed to altered states of mindfulness and consciousness in various meditative and contemplative practices. And we could give more examples of exceptions and variations, of course. But we're clearly no longer in the land of rocks. To further complicate all of this, there's a whole dictionary of vocabulary that comes to mind when I begin to consider the sorts of things I can include in the very broad term I've employed in my description, namely awareness. When I pay attention to the fact that I have awareness of my experiences and the awareness that I am aware, I begin to bring in many other aspects of consciousness. And here's a random list, just sort of interesting choice of words, stream of consciousness, based on what I observe in my own mental processes. So I'm still at the empirical level. I'm just describing what happens, I guess, in my own mind. Let me start with memory. When I'm aware that I experience something, and when I'm aware that I'm aware, I'm doing so, I think, in the present moment, but that only happens very briefly. That cognitive event slides almost immediately into being almost entirely a memory, albeit a very recent and fresh one. I mean, try it. Listen for a sound. That's an experience. And then be attentive to the fact that you're aware of hearing the sound and aware of the fact that you are aware. All of that happens in the past. There's less than a split second of the present. And memory is one of the major components then of what it means to be conscious. Think of it. Most of our consciousness is actually an exercise of our memory. Another mental faculty that I'm aware of as I describe what happens in my mind is imagination. Imagination gets applied to a lot of different things, of course, but as an example, when I engage my imagination to try to picture a future event, I'm assembling the collection of experiences and awarenesses that I have stored away in my memory. There's memory again. But I'm assembling them into a new combination of colors, sights, sounds, feelings, tastes, etc., depending on what specific thing I'm trying to picture. This is similar to creativity, and I know that because I write songs. And when I do so, I know that my imagination is pulling things together from past experiences, from sounds and combinations of sounds which are in me, even though I might not even be aware of remembering them, at least not, and here comes our word again, consciously. So imagination draws from memory and recombines the storehouse. How does it do that? That brings me to another term, another thing I've noticed happening in my mind, and that's what I would call intuition. We've all had that experience of just knowing that we know, or of something just popping into our minds out of nowhere, seemingly. We've all probably had the experience of sensing perhaps that we needed to call somebody. And then when we do, we find out that they really needed to talk, and the timing was perfect. Or we may even find out that they were thinking of us too at that very moment, which raises the question whether the intuitive flash was a merely individualistic thing or part of some other larger aspect of consciousness. That's a rabbit trail for another time. And then of course, there's things we all observe, some of us more aware than others, dreams and the subconscious. And I'm not here jumping to Jung or Freud. I'm just referencing the common human experience of this expression of consciousness and the fact that it surfaces deep dimensions to our, whatever we want to term this for now, our mind or our soul, or our heart, our psyche, etc. I don't want to leave out the mental function of logic and deduction. I tend to be most interested in things like imagination and intuition. I mean, I'm an artist after all, but the human mind has an astonishing ability to think, to apply logic, to use what we call reason, to deduce. And that leads me to another mental faculty that I observe in myself, sometimes less effectively than I wish, and that's problem solving. In some ways, this could be a particular way of combining some of the aspects that we've just been talking about above. Because when we solve a problem, we're employing imagination and deduction and intuition oftentimes. And then there are our emotions. And in Western thinking, oftentimes we separate these from consciousness or the mind, but they're actually a constant, nearly universal aspect of our experience and of our awareness. I say nearly universal because there are actually clinical exceptions, people with no apparent emotional faculty at all, or at least very minimal. And also, we as humans have an astonishing ability to block the awareness of certain emotions, to bury them, to stuff them down. But there is a constant hum of emotion within us. It forms some of the white noise, as it were, of our existence. It's part of our awareness, of our consciousness. And then I'm going to use the term perception here. What I'm trying to get at here is to use that term in a pretty specific way to describe the way that we sometimes know something without being able to describe it. This is different than intuition, where we just sort of have a hunch. This is actually knowing something that we can't explain. And I don't use the term here to refer to something like my perception of her or him really changed when they said such and such. I mean, that is a way of using perception. And again, it may seem similar to intuition, but here I mean the experience of knowing something we just can't describe. Mystics and contemplatives refer to this in many religious heritages, but it's not an exclusively religious thing. I've experienced it in my own creative work and in the poetry and music of others. A song, for example, in which the sounds and melody and lyrics and rhythm all combine in such a way that I know what it means, but can't describe it. That's what I mean by perception. And then the last one that I'll list here, although I'm sure we could make a much longer list, is what I call empathy and compassion. This enlists imagination and intuition, I think, when we intentionally, or even at times when we seem to automatically feel what others are feeling. We're able to put ourselves inside their skin, as it were. This is another aspect of experience and awareness. I do think it involves imagination and emotion and intuition, but I wonder if there's something more here as well. As I thought more about this, it came to me that empathy could be related in some way to that fourth dimension of consciousness, what I called multidimensional, namely that dimension in which a subject, like myself, experiences what another subject, like you, experiences as if it were my own subjective experience. That's what empathy is at least trying to do. That's what it's describing, isn't it? Now, my description of the multidimensional level of consciousness was intended to describe, hypothetically, a subject that possessed a type of consciousness in which there was such a level of entanglement with another subject or subjects that they experienced the experiences and awarenesses of that other subject, not just empathetically or imaginatively, but I would say existentially, even ontologically. They themselves experience the experiences of another subject in the first person as that other first person, not just as if. Empathy is still, in my way of thinking, an as if, but I'm wondering now if this hints at something more, something suggestive of a consciousness that is more than a first-person singular. So empathy as a function of consciousness seems to me, at least, to open out into something bigger, perhaps, than myself, or at least it raises that question for me. This is not a new question in the podcast. Physics and philosophy and religions have raised the question along the way whether there's a bigger consciousness out there, and I keep putting it off with a "we will get there," which is what I still want to say. But while I'm here, let me share a poetic way of wondering about what my experience of empathy brought up, and that's the question of whether human consciousness is bigger. I don't even mean bigger in reference necessarily to anything like the divine, just bigger, a bigger connection. There's a very recent poem of mine that began really as notes scribbled on a card in a church pew during a dear friend's memorial service recently. And it tries to express some of this smallness of human consciousness and the question of whether there's something bigger. I've called it Small as a Life. Small as a life, on seeing an urn in a church. How small is a life, small as ashes, small as a jar, small as a memory, small as a collapsing star, small as dark matter, small as a blaze and a bang, small as a single point of soil and rain, small as amoeba sliding into sunlight on a ball of mud and ash, small as a world held in frames of blinking, wondering, moonlit eyes, small as a soul seeing, touching, knowing, feeling, loving, remembering, small as a life. Now, so far, all I've done is describe my own experiences of consciousness, how my mind operates, really. But is my description in any way an accurate picture of what consciousness actually is? I can't answer that. Not yet. I've merely tried to describe how consciousness works, at least in my own inner world. To say more than that is going to require input from my usual stable of sources, religions, philosophy, and physics. I haven't figured out yet how I'm going to bring those to the table. But as you might guess, that's where we're headed next time.